JD Vance stepped out of the black government car and squinted at the imposing palace before him. London's Buckingham Palace stood massive and unyielding against the grey English sky. This was his first international trip since taking office, and the vice president was determined to make an impression. "Right on time, sir," said his aide, checking her watch. "The British Prime Minister is waiting inside to escort you to the king." Vance nodded, straightening his tie. The importance of this diplomatic mission weighed on him. Relations between the United States and the United Kingdom had grown tense recently over trade disagreements, and his job was to smooth things over. "Remember the protocol briefing, sir?" the aide asked quietly as they approached the palace gates, where a stern-faced royal guard stood at attention, wearing the famous red coat and tall bearskin hat. Sure, Vance replied dismissively. The 30-page briefing document on British royal protocol had remained unread on his tablet. He'd been too busy dealing with domestic issues to care about foreign etiquette rules. How different could it be anyway? The royal guard didn't move a muscle as their party approached. Vance found himself staring at the guard, wondering how anyone could stand so perfectly still. The guard's eyes remained fixed forward, showing no acknowledgement of the American delegation. Something about this lack of recognition bothered Vance. In America, military personnel saluted him wherever he went. The absence of that familiar gesture made him feel strangely invisible. "Let's go," urged his chief of staff. "We're on a tight schedule." But Vance paused. Just a moment. He stepped directly in front of the guard, expecting the man to finally acknowledge him. When nothing happened, Vance cleared his throat. "Good morning," he said loudly. The guard remained frozen, eyes forward, not even blinking. Vance's security detail exchanged uncomfortable glances. This wasn't part of the plan. The British officials waiting inside would be wondering about the delay. "Sir," whispered his aide urgently, "we should proceed inside." But something had taken hold of Vance. Perhaps it was jet lag, or the stress of the high-stakes meeting ahead, or simply being in a foreign country where the usual rules didn't apply. Whatever the reason, he couldn't let this go. "I said good morning," Vance repeated, louder this time. The guard remained impassive. Vance's face flushed. He stepped closer until he was directly in the guard's line of sight. "As the Vice President of the United States, I expect a proper greeting." His staff winced collectively. This wasn't going well. "Sir," his chief of staff whispered, "royal guards don't." "I know what they do and don't do," Vance snapped, though he clearly didn't. He turned back to the guard. "I want a salute. Now." The guard's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flash of what might have been surprise or annoyance. Vance's security team moved closer, sensing tension. Tourists nearby had stopped to watch the unfolding scene, some pulling out phones to record. "This is an order," Vance said firmly. "Salute your superior." For a long, uncomfortable moment, nothing happened. Then the guard's eyes shifted slightly, meeting Vance's gaze directly, a break in protocol that shocked the VP's staff. "Sir," the guard said in a crisp British accent, keeping his body perfectly still except for his mouth. "I serve His Majesty King Charles III. With all due respect, you are not in America, and I do not take orders from foreign officials." Gasps came from the American delegation. Several tourists clapped, quickly silenced by sharp looks from Vance's security detail. Before Vance could respond, the palace doors opened, and the British Prime Minister emerged, smiling diplomatically. "Vice President Vance," he called. "We've been eagerly awaiting your arrival. Is everything all right?" Vance turned, face burning with embarrassment, knowing he'd created an incident before the visit had properly begun. "Everything's fine," he managed to say. "Just admiring your famous guards." "Yes, quite impressive, aren't they?" the Prime Minister replied smoothly, though his eyes revealed he'd been watching the entire exchange. "Shall we proceed? His Majesty doesn't like to be kept waiting." Vance nodded stiffly and followed the Prime Minister inside, leaving the unmoved guard behind. But as the palace doors closed behind them, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made a terrible first impression. News travels fast in diplomatic circles. By the time Vance reached the ornate waiting room adjacent to the king's audience chamber, he could tell from the sidelong glances of the British officials that word of his encounter with the guard had already spread. "His Majesty will see you in 10 minutes, a palace aide informed him with practiced neutrality. Vance's chief of staff, Linda Parker, maneuvered next to him, speaking in a hushed tone. "Sir, we have a situation developing. That incident outside is already on social media." She held up her phone. The video showed Vance demanding a salute, and the guard's calm response. The caption read, "American VP learns he's not in charge everywhere. Damage control," Vance muttered. "Get our people on it." There's more, Linda continued reluctantly. The British press is picking it up. They're calling it an American arrogance incident. The hashtag #NotInAmerica is trending. Vance closed his eyes briefly. This wasn't how this trip was supposed to start. He'd wanted to project strength and authority, not look like an entitled American who didn't understand or respect other nations' protocols. The door opened, and the British Foreign Secretary entered, face carefully composed into a diplomatic smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Vice President Vance," he said warmly, extending his hand. "Welcome to the United Kingdom. I trust your journey was pleasant." "Very," Vance replied, accepting the handshake. "Though I seem to have had a small cultural misunderstanding with one of your guards." The Foreign Secretary's smile remained fixed. "Ah, yes, our guardsmen take their duties quite seriously. They're soldiers first, tourist attractions second. But no matter, these little cultural differences are what makes international relations so fascinating, wouldn't you agree?" The gentle rebuke was clear despite the diplomatic phrasing. "Of course," Vance replied, swallowing his pride. "I'm still adjusting to international protocol." "Perfectly understandable," the Foreign Secretary said. "Perhaps this is a good opportunity to review some basics before you meet His Majesty. For instance, one never speaks to the king, unless spoken to first. One never turns one's back on the king, and one certainly never issues commands to any member of the royal household or its guards." Each point felt like a deliberate reference to what had just happened outside. Vance forced himself to nod agreeably. "I appreciate the guidance," he said. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Against protocol, he glanced at it. A message from the president, "Call me ASAP." Seeing reports from London, Vance's stomach dropped. This was rapidly becoming an international incident. "If I could have a moment of privacy before meeting His Majesty," he asked. The Foreign Secretary nodded. "Of course, this antechamber to your right should suffice." Once alone, Vance called the president, preparing himself for the reprimand. "What the hell happened?" the president demanded without preamble. "CNN is running footage of you trying to order a Buckingham Palace guard to salute you." "It was a misunderstanding," Vance began. Save it," the president cut him off. "The British ambassador just called me. Do you realize how this looks? We're there to repair relations, not make them worse." "I understand, sir. Do you? Because this looks exactly like the stereotype they already believe about us. Arrogant Americans thinking our rules apply everywhere." Vance gripped the phone tighter. "I'll fix it. You'd better. Your meeting with the king starts in 5 minutes? Make it right, JD. Make it right, or catch the next flight home, and I'll send someone who can." The call ended abruptly. Vance stood there, phone in hand, the pressure of the situation fully hitting him. A gentle knock at the door signaled his time was up. "Vice President," Linda called. "They're ready for you now." Vance straightened his tie, squared his shoulders, and prepared to face the king, knowing he needed to somehow salvage both this meeting and his reputation. As he stepped out of the antechamber, he caught sight of a television in the hallway showing the viral video of his confrontation, his face frozen in a moment of entitlement that now made him cringe. The palace aide who had been waiting for him, observed his reaction to the news footage, then said quietly, "This way to His Majesty, sir, and if I may suggest, a small dose of humility goes a long way in these halls." The throne room of Buckingham Palace stretched before Vance like a museum exhibit come to life. Gilded mirrors reflected the crystalline light of chandeliers, centuries of power and tradition pressed down on him from the ornate ceiling. At the far end, King Charles III sat waiting, his expression unreadable. "Vice President Vance of the United States," announced the royal herald. Vance walked forward, remembering the protocol instructions he'd just received. "Don't speak first, don't extend your hand first. Bow slightly from the neck." He followed each instruction carefully, hyper-aware that every eye in the room was watching for another American faux pas. "Vice President Vance," the king said finally, his voice carrying easily across the quiet room. "Welcome to the United Kingdom." "Thank you, Your Majesty," Vance replied, relieved to have been addressed. "It's an honor to be here." The king motioned to a chair positioned near his own. "Please be seated." Vance sat, noticing the chair had been positioned slightly lower than the king's, another subtle reminder of hierarchy. "I understand there was some confusion at the palace entrance," the king said, getting straight to the point. Vance felt his face grow warm. So they would not be glossing over the incident after all. "Yes, Your Majesty, I apologize for my misunderstanding of protocol." The king studied him a moment. You know, those guards, the ones you see standing so still, they're not ornaments. Mr. Vice President, they're soldiers of the Household Division, many with combat experience in Afghanistan and Iraq. They stand guard not for tourists, but because this is their duty to the crown, a tradition spanning centuries. I meant no disrespect, Vance said. Perhaps not intentionally, the king replied. But intention and impact are different matters. The guard you confronted, Sergeant Williams, served 3 tours in dangerous regions. He's earned his position through merit and sacrifice. Vance hadn't expected the king to know the guard's name or service record. The realization that the guard wasn't just a ceremonial figure but a respected soldier made his error feel even worse. I didn't know, Vance admitted. That's precisely the point, the king said, leaning forward slightly. In diplomacy, what we don't know can cause the greatest harm. My understanding is that you came to discuss trade agreements. The abrupt change of subject caught Vance off guard. Yes, Your Majesty, then let us discuss trade. But remember this moment, Mr. Vice President. Foreign soil requires foreign courtesy. We may speak the same language, but we are not the same country. The following 30 minutes proceeded with formal discussions about trade relationships between their nations. The king was knowledgeable and engaged, showing none of the coldness Vance had feared after the guard incident. Still, the vice president couldn't fully relax, feeling that he was being tested with every response. As their meeting concluded, the king rose, signaling the end of the audience. Before you go, the king said, I've arranged something I think might be educational. My equerry will show you to the Guards Museum after we conclude. I believe understanding more about the men behind the uniforms might provide valuable context for the remainder of your visit. Vance recognized the assignment for what it was, partly a punishment, partly a lesson, and entirely mandatory. That would be most appreciated, Your Majesty, he replied, having no choice but to accept. As he was escorted from the throne room, Vance's aide whispered, The president called again while you were with the king. He wants an update as soon as possible. Tell him I'm handling it, Vance replied, wondering if that was actually true. The equerry, a sharp-eyed military officer in uniform, waited for him at the door. This way, Mr. Vice President. The Guards Museum isn't typically on the itinerary for visiting officials, but His Majesty thought you might find it particularly relevant today. The subtle emphasis on today wasn't lost on Vance. As they walked through the palace corridors, he noticed several staff members quickly looking away as he passed, some failing to hide small smiles. His humiliation wasn't over yet. The Guards Museum was a compact but impressive display of British military history. Glass cases housed medals, weapons, and uniforms spanning centuries of service. The vice president's security detail remained near the entrance, while the equerry, Major James Blackwood, guided Vance through the exhibits. These 5 regiments make up the Foot Guards, Major Blackwood explained, gesturing to a display of different colored plumes and buttons that distinguished each regiment. The guard you met earlier was from the Grenadier Guards, the most senior infantry regiment in the British Army, formed in 1656. Vance nodded, trying to show interest despite feeling this was an elaborate form of punishment. Each guardsman undergoes months of training before they ever stand post at the palace, the major continued. They're selected for their discipline and composure. Standing motionless for hours isn't just for show, it's a demonstration of the extraordinary self-control expected of those who guard the sovereign. They move to a display showing photographs of guardsmen in various combat zones, desert camouflage, replacing the famous red tunics. Many people forget these men are active duty soldiers, Major Blackwood said. When not performing ceremonial duties, they deploy to conflict zones like any other infantry unit. Sergeant Williams, whom you met earlier, received the Military Cross for bravery in Afghanistan. Vance stopped abruptly. The guard I spoke to has a military cross. Indeed, the major replied, maintaining perfect composure. He led his squad through an ambush, carried 2 wounded men to safety under heavy fire. Not the sort of man who responds well to being ordered about by foreign officials, as I'm sure you can understand. The vice president felt a new wave of embarrassment. He treated a decorated war hero like a tourist attraction. I had no idea. Few visitors do, Major Blackwood said. They see the ceremonial uniform and forget the soldier wearing it. They continued through the museum, past displays of battle honors and memorials to fallen guardsmen. Vance found himself genuinely interested, despite his initial reluctance. The protocols these men follow date back hundreds of years, the major explained. When they stand guard, they represent not just military discipline but the continuous thread of British history. They don't salute foreign officials because their allegiance is specifically to the crown. Even foreign heads of state, Vance asked. Foreign heads of state receive different protocols. A head of state would be greeted with appropriate ceremony arranged in advance. Vice presidents, prime ministers, and other officials receive formal welcomes, but not military salutes from palace guards. Vance nodded, absorbing the lesson. I should have been briefed better. With respect, sir, I understand you were, Major Blackwood replied, his expression neutral but his meaning clear. Before Vance could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from his chief of staff. Press conference in 30 minutes. British media waiting. Need statement on guard incident. I need to prepare for a press conference, Vance said. Major Blackwood nodded. Of course, there's just one more stop, His Majesty specifically requested you make. They turned a corner to find themselves facing a life-sized photograph of Sergeant Williams, the very guard Vance had confronted, standing in his formal uniform, next to another photograph of the same man in combat gear, arm in arm with fellow soldiers in Afghanistan. Sergeant Williams will be at the changing of the guard ceremony tomorrow, Major Blackwood said. His Majesty thought you might want to attend. Vance understood the implicit instruction. This wasn't a suggestion, it was a diplomatic requirement. His presence at the ceremony would be a public acknowledgement of respect for the institution he had insulted. I'll be there, he said. As they walked back toward the palace proper, Vance's mind raced. The press conference would be brutal. British journalists weren't known for pulling punches, and American reporters would be equally merciless about his cultural misstep. One last thing, Mr. Vice President, Major Blackwood said, as they approached the palace exit. There's an old saying in diplomatic circles, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Perhaps in this case, when in Britain, do as the British do would have served you well. Vance nodded. Lesson learned, Major. Let's hope so, sir, the Major replied. Because your press conference begins in 20 minutes, and from what I hear, the journalists are rather looking forward to it. The press room buzzed with anticipation. British and American journalists filled every seat, with more standing along the walls. Camera lenses focused on the empty podium like weapons aimed at a target. Vance stood just outside the door, reviewing talking points with his communications director. They're going to hit hard on the guard incident, she warned. British tabloids are calling it American arrogance, while the more respectful papers are framing it as a cultural misunderstanding. Either way, it's the only thing they want to talk about. What about the trade discussions? Vance asked. Secondary at best. This has become about American respect or lack thereof, for British institutions. Great, Vance muttered. Just apologize clearly, show you've learned something, and pivot to the substantive issues, she advised. Don't get defensive, that'll make it worse. Vance nodded, and straightened his tie. Let's get this over with. The moment he stepped to the podium, cameras clicked furiously. He could feel the energy in the room, journalists sensing vulnerability, ready to pounce. Good afternoon, he began. Before taking questions about today's productive discussions on trade relations, I'd like to address the incident at Buckingham Palace this morning. He took a deep breath. I made a mistake. In attempting to receive what would be a customary acknowledgement in America, I failed to respect the different protocols that apply here in the United Kingdom. For that I apologize, to the guard involved, to the palace, and to the British people. Hands shot up immediately. Vance pointed to a reporter from the BBC. Vice President Vance, isn't this incident symptomatic of a broader American assumption that your customs should be universal? Vance gripped the podium. I wouldn't characterize it that way. It was an individual error on my part, not a reflection of American foreign policy. He called on an American reporter next, hoping for an easier question. Mr. Vice President, sources say the president called you immediately after the incident. Is he concerned about its impact on US-UK relations? So much for an easier question. The president and I are always in communication during important diplomatic missions, Vance replied carefully. He supports my efforts to strengthen our relationship with the United Kingdom. A British tabloid reporter stood without being called on. Would you say you've learned your lesson about not being in America anymore? The directness of the question caused a ripple of uncomfortable laughter through the room. Vance forced a smile. I'd say I've been reminded of the importance of understanding and respecting other nations' traditions and protocols. Yes. Questions continued for 20 minutes, most circling back to the morning's incident, despite Vance's attempts to steer the conversation toward trade negotiations. Finally, his communications director signaled from the side that time was up. "Thank you all," Vance concluded. "I look forward to continuing productive discussions with British officials tomorrow." As he stepped away from the podium, a final question rang out. "Will you be attending tomorrow's changing of the guard, Mr. Vice President?" Vance turned back to the microphone. "Yes, I will. I've learned it's an important tradition with deep meaning, not just a tourist spectacle. I look forward to observing it with the respect it deserves." Back in the privacy of his quarters at the ambassador's residence, Vance collapsed into a chair. "That was brutal." His chief of staff nodded. "Could have been worse." The apology helped. The president called yet twice. "He's watching how this plays out." Vance rubbed his temples. "And how is it playing out?" "Mixed. Some are saying it's refreshing to see an American official admit a mistake. Others are using it to reinforce stereotypes about American ignorance of other cultures." "Fantastic," Vance muttered. "There's something else," she said hesitantly. "Sergeant Williams, the guard, has been asked to comment by several outlets." Vance looked up sharply. "And he's declined all interviews, saying only that he was performing his duty as expected." "Small mercies," Vance said. "At least he's not twisting the knife." "Actually," his chief of staff said, checking her phone, "there's a message from the palace. The king has invited you to personally meet Sergeant Williams after tomorrow's changing of the guard ceremony." Vance stared at her. "Is that good or bad?" "I'm told it's unprecedented," she replied. "Take from that what you will." The next morning dawned bright and clear, a rarity for London. Vance stood among the crowds gathered for the changing of the guard, his security detail trying to maintain a low profile while keeping him safe in the public setting. "That's him," he heard someone whisper. "The American who tried to make the guard salute." Vance kept his eyes forward, pretending not to hear. The ceremony was about to begin, and he was determined to observe it properly this time. The precision of the event impressed him. Guards marched in perfect unison, their movements synchronized to the second. The band played traditional military tunes, their red uniforms bright against the palace backdrop. "Sergeant Williams is leading the new guard," his cultural attaché whispered, pointing to the tall guardsman at the front of the formation. Vance recognized him immediately, the same impassive face that had put him in his place yesterday. Today the sergeant led his men with calm authority, his movements crisp and deliberate. As the ceremony concluded, an aide from the palace approached Vance. "His Majesty requests your presence for the private meeting we discussed," she said quietly. Vance followed her through a side entrance, away from the departing tourists. They walked down a corridor and into a small room, where the king waited, along with Sergeant Williams, now standing at perfect attention. "Vice President Vance," the king greeted him. "I believe you've met Sergeant Williams under less formal circumstances." "Yes, Your Majesty," Vance replied, then turned to the sergeant. "It's good to see you again, Sergeant." Williams remained at attention, eyes forward, until the king spoke. "At ease, Sergeant, you may speak freely." Only then did the guardsman relax slightly. "Sir," he acknowledged Vance with a nod. "I wanted to apologize directly," Vance said. "I failed to respect your position and the traditions you uphold." Williams' expression remained professional. "Thank you, sir." Apology accepted. The king watched this exchange with interest. Sergeant Williams has served the crown for 15 years. In that time he's encountered many visitors unfamiliar with our protocols. "Though few as direct as yourself, sir," Williams added, the faintest hint of humor in his eyes. Vance found himself smiling. "I imagine not." "I've asked Sergeant Williams to explain something to you," the king said. "Something I think might put yesterday's incident in perspective." Williams nodded. "Sir, what you may not understand is that when I stand guard, I'm not ignoring you or anyone else. I'm actively performing a duty that requires complete focus and discipline. It's not personal, it's centuries of tradition embodied in a living soldier." "I understand that now," Vance said. Furthermore, Williams continued, "While I don't salute foreign officials, there are proper channels and protocols for all diplomatic encounters. Had your visit to the guard post been arranged through official means, appropriate courtesy would have been extended." Vance nodded, absorbing the lesson. "So there is a right way to do it." "There's always a right way in diplomacy," the king interjected. It simply requires advanced communication and mutual respect. After a few more minutes of conversation, the king dismissed Sergeant Williams, who executed a perfect salute to his monarch before departing. Once they were alone, the king turned to Vance. I arranged this not to embarrass you further, but because I believe in learning from our missteps. The special relationship between our countries is too important to be derailed by a momentary cultural confusion. I appreciate that, Your Majesty, Vance replied sincerely. Now, the king said, rising from his seat, shall we return to those trade negotiations? I believe we have actual work to do beyond sorting out palace protocols. As they walked together toward the meeting room, Vance felt a weight lifting. The incident wasn't forgotten, but it was being placed in proper perspective, a bumpy start, not a diplomatic disaster. The final day of Vance's visit arrived with considerably less drama than its beginning. The trade negotiations had progressed well, with both sides finding workable compromises. As Vance prepared to depart for the airport, a package arrived from Buckingham Palace. Inside was a small framed photograph of the palace guards on duty, with a note from the king, a reminder that tradition and protocol serve a purpose, but so does forgiveness for honest mistakes. Safe travels. Charles R. Vance smiled, placing the frame carefully in his briefcase. His chief of staff entered with the final schedule. Car leaves in 20 minutes, sir. The Prime Minister will see you off. Any last media disasters I should know about? Vance asked. Actually, the narrative has shifted. They're calling it a diplomatic learning moment. Your attendance at the changing of the guard and the private meeting afterward have been well received. So I'm not an international incident anymore. More of an international anecdote now, she replied with a smile. The president called. He's pleased with how you turned things around. At the airport, the British Prime Minister shook Vance's hand warmly. As they said their goodbyes, I understand you've had quite the cultural immersion this trip, the Prime Minister said. You could say that, Vance agreed. You know, Vice President, every diplomat has a story like this from their early days. Mine involved accidentally sitting in the Japanese emperor's chair. Took months to live that down. Vance laughed. That does make me feel better. The mark of good diplomacy isn't avoiding all mistakes, it's how you recover from them, the Prime Minister said. Safe journey home. As Air Force 2 lifted off from British soil, Vance gazed out the window at the receding landscape. His phone buzzed with a text from the president. Good recovery. Next time, read the briefing papers before you land. Vance chuckled and typed back. Lesson learned. He closed his eyes, reflecting on the whirlwind visit. What had begun as an embarrassing gaffe had become a valuable lesson in international relations. Sometimes being reminded you're not in America anymore was exactly what an American official needed. The incident would follow him, he knew, probably becoming an anecdote in political circles and diplomatic training sessions, but it had also humanized him in a way that carefully scripted appearances never could. As the plane leveled off above the clouds, Vance made a mental note before his next international trip. He would personally review every page of protocol briefings, no matter how tedious. Some lessons you only needed to learn once. When they touched down in Washington hours later, a reporter shouted a question as he descended the stairs from the plane. Vice President Vance, anything you want to say to Americans traveling abroad? Vance paused, then smiled. Yes, remember that you're representing our country, and when you're not in America, don't expect things to work like they do in America.